Hello everyone! Today I'm changing it up slightly by reviewing the story Oroonoko or the Royal Slave by Aphra Behn. It's a tragic romance book that takes place during the early parts of the 1600s. I know this is my first foray into doing a literature summary/review, and I know I'm starting off strong with a story about the transatlantic slave trade, but hopefully you guys like this piece. Because when I was reading it, something just stuck with me and I needed to talk about it. So first things first, we need to talk about the author, Aphra Behn, because this story is written from a first-person perspective where the narrator actually has a character within the story. Behn was an English spy who more than likely grew up in the South American colony of Suriname, where the story takes place in the mid-1600s. I know how weird it is to say more than likely for anyone's history, especially when they're a well-known author, but on behalf of the whole spy part, and more importantly the whole woman part, the records for her early life aren't well fleshed out. On top of that, she ended up moving back to Britain where she eventually got her job as a spy against the Dutch. Her job, though important and backed by the crown, never paid her either, so Behn took up writing in order to pay to live. Behn wrote a variety of plays on top of the novel Oroonoko, but her work was placed under the gaze of serious scrutiny and she was essentially literarily blackballed. Behn had only a select few female authors such as Virginia Woolf who really gave her work any credence, and it's a damn shame too. Sure, we have hindsight now, and since then we've rectified the wrongs that were done to one of the first and well-known female English writers, but she was still suffocated under the male-centric English canon for a very long time. Anyway, back to Oroonoko, which opens up with Behn's travel blog, which is a very commonplace thing to happen at this juncture in time since travel narratives in the age of exploration became incredibly popular. You know, with the discovery of a bunch of new lands and whatnot. She also begins with letting the reader know that she only heard about the beginning of the story through talking to Oroonoko, but that she was first-hand witness to all the other goings-on once the story takes place in Suriname. We're taken to Coromantien, a West African kingdom, where we're introduced to the beautiful and great and Roman-looking and beautiful and handsome Oroonoko, the Prince of Coromantien. The titular character, Oroonoko, is an all-around manly man. He's the greatest general. He's the most beautiful man. He's the most incredible person. And he's a prince. As he's an African prince, Behn makes sure that we as the reader know that he is the most Romanized, beautiful man that anyone has ever seen. And makes some pretty racist remarks throughout the piece about him. Because she talks about how Romanized he is, she also decries the outward appearance of other African peoples. No one said she isn't a product of her time. It's really important that I hammer in how pretty Oroonoko is, because throughout the story, his beauty is the biggest signifier of his royal designation. Another thing to note is that Behn always writes good characters with overly positive adjectives, and bad characters with scathing remarks. The H in Behn stands for hyperbole. Oroonoko has no immediate family, as everyone else around him has died except for his grandfather, the king of Coromantien. But this changes when Oroonoko meets Imawinda, the daughter of one of his generals, and also notably the general that died saving Oroonoko from a stray arrow by throwing his head in the way of it. Anyway, Imawinda is also incredibly beautiful and is like a goddess to Oroonoko's god. Behn actually states that she's the Venus to his Mars. They get to know each other a little better and they decide that they should get married. Because what else are two incredibly hot people gonna do with each other? Oroonoko, however, is a man of honor and says that he needs to let his grandfather know about the marriage before it can happen. Bad move. See, Oroonoko's grandfather, the king, is actually pretty entranced with Imawinda as well and takes her to his castle to see if he can have her as another one of his wives. To make sure that she isn't in love with anyone else or a particular someone, he decides that he's going to test her by saying that Oroonoko got her a gift. This backfires on the king, and he finds out that Imawinda is absolutely head over heels for Oroonoko. Being the king, he's not a fan of this at all. Regardless, the king is the king and doesn't really care if she's actually in love with someone else because he's already sent out the royal veil to her, a marriage proposal that Imawinda is culturally obligated to accept. Oroonoko is understandably miffed. It's not every day that you're about to get married to someone and then that person is propositioned to be married to a king. So, Oroonoko gets his buddy Aphra and his girlfriend Onahal to get him to help out by delivering messages to Imawinda while she's stuck in the palace. Onahal, one of the king's many old wives, happily obliges, and Imawinda is able to keep a connection to Oroonoko. One night, Oroonoko plans to meet Imawinda in her chambers and show an act of love to her. Just because she's betrothed to someone else doesn't mean that she doesn't still love him. Some guards come walking in on them, and Oroonoko tells them to go. But because of this, the king now knows that Oroonoko has slept with his soon-to-be bride. The next day, Imawinda lies to the king and says that Oroonoko forcibly took her, which puts the king in a different position. He can't be mad at her for losing her chastity by force, but he also doesn't want to marry someone who isn't a virgin. So he makes a compromise and sells her into slavery. He wipes his hands of the issue and realizes something.
Oroonoko is going to be pissed. Oroonoko has all of the military power. Oroonoko can totally overthrow me if he knew that I sold off his wife. I might die!
So, thinking quick on his feet, instead of telling Oroonoko that Imawinda was sold off into slavery, the king instead tells Oroonoko that he killed Imawinda. This plan surprisingly works for the king, and Oroonoko leaves, understandably crushed. So he decides that the only way he's going to be able to cope with this is by going on military expeditions. So he walks out and goes toward the coast to try and do some military stuff. While Oroonoko is off doing military stuff, he comes across sea captains who regularly trade in slaves and other commodities. So Oroonoko gets to know them pretty well, and the slaver sea captains see this incredibly handsome man and think to themselves, we can get a lot of money for this. So one night, they invite Oroonoko and his band of men to a party in the woods where they capture him and place him on a boat heading for Suriname, a colony in South America. As you may know, the transatlantic slave trade was not a safe business for many of the captured humans on the boat, and the poor conditions on the ship meant that the men and women were only given just enough to survive, if that much. Oroonoko is pretty pissed about his situation and makes an agreement with all the other slaves aboard the ship to go on a hunger strike until they are guaranteed their freedom. The slavers normally wouldn't care, but since the entire ship has now decided to die, they realize, we can lose a lot of money from this. And they capitulate to Oroonoko and his band's request. Oroonoko makes the deal with them on his honor, and the sea captain swears on his god that they will be free men when they reach the colony, so long as they end the hunger strike. Oroonoko accepts, but as we all know, this sea captain is scummy and not described in positive detail by Ben, so he's definitely a bad guy. Once they reach Suriname, Oroonoko and his group has the rug pulled out from underneath them, and Oroonoko is sold into slavery to a man named Trefree. Trefree is a good guy though, because Ben doesn't describe him negatively, so we know that Oroonoko will be safe. Oroonoko is renamed Caesar because he's so handsome and beautiful and therefore royal. And because Trefree isn't that awful of a human, he gives Oroonoko his own house and a bunch of land to live on. Oroonoko soon becomes friends with Trefree and Ben's author insert character, and lives pretty comfortably in slavery, even engaging in selling and trading slaves himself. Hey, I didn't say Oroonoko is a likable character. After some time acclimating to South America, Trefree mentions in passing that there's the most beautiful woman that he's ever laid his eyes on in the colony. She belongs to a neighboring slave owner, and she is so beautiful that Trefree admits that he could barely contain the urge to do very bad, forcible things to her. Oroonoko's interest is piqued, and Trefree wants to play matchmaker, so he takes Oroonoko to meet this woman, Clemene, and Oroonoko is surprised to find out that Clemene is actually Imawinda. They find each other again, thousands of miles away! They quickly revitalize their romance and get married, because slavery isn't too hard on either Imawinda or Oroonoko. They basically get to live as royalty, selling and trading slaves in comfort while other slaves are graciously throwing themselves at their feet because of their beauty. Oroonoko gets to go on cool adventures in the South American rainforest, fighting tigers and even almost getting killed by an electric eel. There are actually some really cool symbolic parts during this part of the story, but since they aren't 100% plot relevant, I'm just going to glance over it. The story continues though, and now we're in the final part of it. Oroonoko is content with his slave life until one day Imawinda goes up to him and says, "Hey, look, I'm pregnant." Oroonoko, after all his luxuries he's been given, thinks really hard about slavery and decides,
Hey, you know, I don't like this now that it's affecting me.
He gets together with one of his few friends in the colony, Tuscan, a fellow slave, and tells Tuscan about his plan to start a slave rebellion. Tuscan is way apprehensive since he's got a family and people that depend on him in the colony and doesn't want the horrors of slavery to happen to him for being disobedient and being part of the coup. Oroonoko hears only one part of this and tells Tuscan, well, that's why we need to rebel, because we don't deserve this. Tuscan, who doesn't get the same luxury that Oroonoko receives in the colony, is very apprehensive and tells him that everyone has a family that they don't want to jeopardize because of this attempt at freedom. Oroonoko opts to ignore this and rallies a bunch of people together to leave in the middle of the night. The next morning, all the slave owners wake up and one thing comes into their mind. We're going to lose a lot of money from this. So they gather together to make a search party to find Oroonoko and all the others who ran away. This conglomerate search party finds the runaways and they get into a huge battle with slaves and slavers getting killed alike. Imoinda also shoots a leader in the colony, Byam, with a poison arrow. Until the slavers say that they won't punish anyone who ran away if they just come back. At this request, most of the men and women that were on Oroonoko's side see that the proposition isn't too bad, and it leaves Oroonoko, Tuscan, and Imoinda left fighting against the rest of the group. At seeing that they're outnumbered, they surrender and Tuscan and Oroonoko are whipped into inches of their life. Oroonoko is pissed. Slavery finally got real for Oroonoko. Once he heals up, he forgives Trefree for recapturing them and plans to make another escape with Imoinda. This time, it'll just be them two who run away. They leave that night into the rainforest, and after traveling some distance, Oroonoko realizes that there isn't a way that they're actually going to leave the shackles of slavery. He tells Imoinda that he needs to kill her and their baby to make sure that nothing abhorrent happens to them, because he knows that he'll get whipped, but they may do unspeakable horrors to her for disobeying. He kills Imoinda with his own hands, and vows that he will get revenge on Byam for subjecting him to such cruel punishments and defiling his honor. But he's stricken with grief at the loss of his wife and his unborn child, and he can't move from the place that Imoinda died at. A search party finally catches up to him, led by Tuscan. But when Tuscan sees Oroonoko weak and frail from exhaustion and malnutrition, he wants to help out his friend and protect him from death. Oroonoko accidentally stabs Tuscan when Oroonoko attempts to commit suicide by ripping out a part of his neck and cutting open his stomach. Oroonoko's intestines fall out, and then he passes out from either pain or blood loss or just good old-fashioned death. Of course, that death isn't enough for the slavers, and they instead resuscitate Oroonoko, bringing him back to life over a few weeks, only to tie him to a post and dismember him. They start with his member and send all his pieces to different landowners within the colony. So yeah, that's a really heavy piece. But it's the small things within the story that really stick out to me. This story is a proto-abolitionist piece that centers around the brutality that happens because of the slave trade. There are some people who say that this piece isn't so much anti-slavery and more so anti-Christian, but I don't know how much I personally believe that statement. Sure, there are times where the Christian characters betray the trust of Oroonoko. For example, on the boat, Oroonoko, after finding out he was bamboozled by the captain, says that he doesn't trust men that swear on a god, because those men don't keep their promises. But the sheer brutality of the whippings and the merciless hewing of Oroonoko into pieces at the end is so obviously over the top and graphic that this piece drew tons of eyes because of the acts that were described in the story. Another thing to take note of within the story is how everything is described in a way that would make it more palatable to an English audience. This is still taking place in the Age of Exploration, so many of the foreign and alien plant life and animals that were seen in both Suriname and in Africa are described in a way that Europeans who had never seen the creatures could relate to them. This way of describing things also goes into describing the African peoples and the native peoples of South America. These people are seen as primitive and innocent through the hand of Ben. And the way that she tries to get her contemporaries to relate with Oroonoko is by literally talking about him in a Romanized way. Oroonoko, through his descriptions in the story, is just an Italian man with jet black skin. And Imoinda is so hot that even white people would die for her love. We've had enough time and distance from this overt racism now to understand that these outdated ideas of race relations are wrong, but it still feels weird talking about them in this manner. There are also huge chunks of the story that I kind of mentioned before that are just Ben's travel blog. This is really common during this period because of the New World being so mystic and foreign to everyone. This meant that these lands were described as almost magical and also a blank slate where anyone could go to experience this wonder and spice up their life. So there's a little context if for some reason the travel narrative portion of the story didn't make a whole lot of sense to you. I still have a lot to say about this piece, the symbolism, the code of honor that Oroonoko has, but I think I should leave that for another time. Thanks for sticking around this long though. Anyway, tell me how you like this video. I know it's different than what I normally produce, but hopefully this was still pretty enjoyable to listen to. As always, like, share, and subscribe, and thanks for watching the video. This is Patrick, signing off.